Scott just made the point.
Jefferson used to be a lot more secure, not just.
Follow the government's dietary advice and you could wake up dead, or at least morbidly obese. I'm PJTV's Scott Ott, joined now by Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And men, this week, the New York Times carried a column by Nina Teichholz noting that recent research shows the government advice was a tad counterproductive, which is my way of saying fatal. Here's the money quote. For 2 generations, Americans ate fewer eggs and other animal products because policymakers told them that fat and cholesterol were bad for their health. Now, both dogmas have been debunked in quick succession. She says that following Big Brother's advice, over the past half-century, we've cut fat intake by 25% and replaced it with 30% more pasta, bread, sugar, and starchy vegetables. Now, the government says that food fat isn't really what causes artery fat and that low-fat diets may actually be harmful. Last week, the National Institutes of Health said that there is, quote, no appreciable relationship, end quote, between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. So for decades, we've been avoiding stuff that tastes great in order to milk a few more years out of our bland lives here in the bizarro world, all the while eating ourselves to death in the shadow of the government-approved food pyramid. Now, thanks to Uncle Sam's brainwashing of school kids, we're chubby, diabetic, cardiac grenades ready to explode. Stephen Green, I can't recall ever hearing a Republican argue that the federal government shouldn't be funding health research. Why not?
You know what, that is a really, really good question, Scott. And you know, let me approach it this way. It's not just the government that gets things like this wrong. Kind of a cynical view of science would be today's scientists, it's their job to figure out what yesterday's scientists got wrong, and it's the job of tomorrow's scientists to figure out what today's scientists got wrong. It's an ever-improving understanding of the world around us, and yeah, mistakes are going to get made, and there's a method behind it to correct those mistakes in the future. That's just the way it works. But when the government gets involved, suddenly this research carries the weight, the force of government. It's not just a guy in a lab saying that we've got to cut these things out or eat more of this. It's the government saying these things, and that gives it an imprint, a stature that it wouldn't normally have. And so instead of people doing the things that we are physically designed to do, you know, we've got the teeth of omnivores, we've got digestive tracts that are good for pretty much anything. So instead of eating a balanced diet of the things we enjoy and the things that are healthy and getting in that good mix, we've been following these rules. And the thing is, no matter what the government says today, the premise hasn't gone away that it's the government's job to tell us. Well, is it? Throw that one back at you.
You know, based on what Steve Green just said, I think the solution for me is for the next 40 years, I'm going to live completely in hindsight. Bill Whittle, if you were not a conspiracy theorist, you might not think the government is trying to kill us all, or at least to make us too lethargic to resist. So what is your theory?
I thought the science was settled, frankly. I mean, nutritionists had reached a consensus. I think it was something like 97% of all nutritionists bought into this food pyramid thing and said eggs were bad for you. For 2 generations, the science has been settled, and now suddenly you're telling me it's unsettled, Scott? That's an unsettling thing to unsettle a person with. You know, while you were talking about this, I had the most bizarre, remarkable idea. So let me just give it to you real quick. My question was, well, if they're wrong about this and they're wrong about everything else, then how do we know what's right to eat, right? And I thought, well, why don't we just eat what tastes good? And then I had actually a fairly profound thought. You know, I'm a big believer in natural selection and evolution. And so there's reasons for things. For instance, if you cut your hand and you start to bleed, many people will faint. Why? Well, because if you faint, you go flat, your blood pressure goes down, and you're less likely to bleed out. So fainting at the sight of blood, especially your own blood, there's a pretty good reason for this. So as we were talking about this, I thought, why is bacon delicious? Why? Why is bacon the king of the food groups? Because it's good for you. Because if you had two tribes of proto-cavemen, one who loved bacon and one who hated bacon, the ones who ate all the bacon, if bacon was bad for you, would die, and that love of bacon would be out of the gene pool, and we would smell bacon, and we'd all retch, and it'd be horrible, but everybody knows bacon is delicious. If bacon's delicious because it's good for you. I think it's the same thing with eggs. I think the reason most people don't like spinach or kale is because that's what you eat when there's no bacon, right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It won't kill you. But if you have a choice of bacon or spinach, you go with the bacon. But if you're in the mountains and there is no bacon immediately at hand and you're really stuck, eat some spinach. And I think that's how we ought to do it. I think we ought to just basically say, what's delicious? Let's eat that. Every now and then, if we can't afford bacon, we'll get a little bit of roughage in there. But as long as we don't eat too much of it, we'll probably be just fine.
You know, you may not be too far off, even biblically. You know, in the Old Testament, when they set up the first tabernacle, they had this great altar where they would essentially cook meat. And this was considered a pleasing aroma to the Lord.
You betcha.
We worship a God who loves the smell of cooking meat. What could be wrong with that?
And if God eats steak, it's ribeye, guaranteed.
There you go.
And scotch.
Well, when the king hires a portrait artist, we don't expect a lifelike rendering as a result. Likewise, when the government hands down lifestyle guidelines, that information doesn't emerge from a purified beaker of empirical data, but via government-funded research filtered through a septic system of political hacks and cronies. They were wrong about salt, wrong about antibacterial soap, wrong about coffee, wrong about bacon and butter, and the list goes on. Well, if you now wonder what you should eat, I think it's a safe bet to avoid anything the government says is good for you. Eat what you want. If it kills you, good news. You found the only way to escape the government busybodies. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the entire Trifecta crew at PJTV.com, I'm Scott Ott.